and welcome to the Shock Absorber podcast. It's great to have you along with us, whether you're listening on your podcast app or watching us on YouTube. And I am joined by the plaid crew today. Very plaid.
We're plaid.
We're plaid. Welcome, Tim.
That's
good to have
right.
you back. You've been on the last couple of episodes. It's great to have you back.
Yes, great to be back.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming. And Stu,
Hello.
I know you've worn it before. I do like that John Deere hat.
Do you?
Yeah,
What do you
no.
like about it?
I think it has bold colours.
Yeah.
And I think it's just, I think it fits well with your
Aesthetic.
aesthetic, general aura.
Aura of, I don't know what the aura is.
I think it might just work well with your hair and stuff. I think it looks
Okay,
good.
thank you.
I like it. But I do like the green and black. I think that's a
Okay.
cool.
Thank you.
That's good. Why do you have a John Deere hat? Did you buy a ride-on mower or something?
No. No, I have lived most of my life on the seaboard, eastern seaboard of
You're going to say on the
Sydney.
sea. I'm a sailor.
It's a sea shanty, so my middle name. No, I lived in Solent Shire for most of my life, but my father was a bank manager, and when we were in primary school, we moved to the country down to Narrandera, which is about 8 hours southwest of Sydney in the rural Riverina in New South Wales. And we grew up there for about 3 years, and while I was there, Dad was a bank manager, so we used to spend a lot of time on farms. So every weekend we'd go and see a different farm, which was heaps of fun. And most of it was wheat, sheep, and I developed a great interest and maybe even a love of tractors and combine harvesters and big Mack trucks. And the kids at school in Sydney in primary school, we used to draw little surfers on surfboards surfing in class or whatever. But when we were in Narrandera, we used to draw Mack trucks and Massey combine harvesters, and so John Deere harvesters. So anyway, I told my wife Lou about those stories and how I love a Massey Ferguson combine harvester or a John Deere combine harvester. Combine harvesters just harvest wheat. They're massive machines and very impressive to ride in them. Anyway, so I've told Lou those stories over the years, and at Christmas she found this hat in a surf shop of all places, which was quite funny.
It's odd.
And so someone told me the other day it's called rural chic or something.
Oh,
I don't know,
yeah.
there's some kind of term for it. But anyway, so Lou saw the John Deere and thought, I think Stu would like that.
No, that's
Got
cool.
it for Christmas, I was very stoked. So
lovely.
yeah, it sort of reminds me of when I was a kid.
But it also speaks a bit to your identity. That's what I like about
That's
it.
a
I
bit,
think.
really, in a way.
It's fun.
Yeah, interesting.
I appreciate that. No hat for you today, Tim, though.
No hat.
But you did bring the cultural artifacts. But before we get to that, I would notice that you tweeted, or do you X'd now?
I don't know what I do.
They're still calling it Twitter, aren't they? They're
Well,
saying
It's not really, no. It's
X
just
used to be
X.
called Twitter, but they're not saying X'd.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Oh, right.
They
I
tweet,
don't know
though.
what
They still
you
say
still
they
tweet.
tweet.
You still
I
tweet
still
on
hear
X.
people talking about tweeting.
Okay.
Don't you? You hear that?
Yeah, I think so.
don't know. I don't spend a lot of time on Twitter now.
You posted on X.
I did
But
post
just
on
watching
X.
TV and stuff, they
They
call
still
it
call it, yeah.
tweeting or posting on X. Yeah.
Yeah. Which
I've noticed
I
that
like the
people
original name.
have stopped saying formerly known as Twitter.
I'll have that.
They will just, more people will just say on X.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So have you stopped going on it as a protest?
No, just no. I just try and minimise my
I've heard some people
social media.
protesting.
No, I don't think I care that much either way about
don't
what
protesting.
are they
it.
protesting against? Elon Musk.
I think so.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Not 100% sure what exactly. Something
Yeah.
about free speech or something.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no, it's far less ideological and more just trying to use my time wisely.
Just protecting your brain.
But you did tweet that you're going to Chicago soon.
I am going to
Soonish.
Chicago soon.
Why are you going to Chicago?
There is a conference happening called the Children's Spirituality Summit,
Wow.
being hosted by a new institute for children's ministry out of TEDS, the Trinity Evangelical Divinity School.
Okay.
I think is the correct acronym. Apologies if I got that wrong, TEDS. This is a conference that I have been interested in for a while. I like reading the books that come out of the conference. They're always quite stimulating. Don't agree with everything in them, which I think is the point, is that they're trying to make you think from a whole lot of variety of different theological perspectives. But there's a strong connection between that conference and the intergenerational conference that I've been to twice now in Nashville. And so I thought I put an application in for a paper, and they accepted, and my boss is happy to pay. So
you're speaking on it. No?
So yeah, I'm going to go speak and present a paper at the conference, and spend 3 days talking about children's ministry and children's spirituality with a whole variety of different people, some of whom I've met at other places, and a whole lot of new people as well.
Are you excited?
Very excited. Yeah. I really love it. I find those kind of environments really stimulating. Lots of different people thinking about different things. Everyone who's passionate about children coming at it from a lot of different angles. What I've found, particularly in the intergenerational space, is even when there's lots of different and various theological traditions, and there's lots of stuff that we would disagree about that is quite central to our tradition. Actually, we come together and say, from within our tradition, we're interested in talking about this topic. People are really excited and focused and really collaborative, and really honour the other people in the space. And so I've never found people being upset or angry about difference. Actually, they find it exciting and stimulating, and tell me from your tradition why this matters. Tell me from your tradition. So, I just kind of think that some of the things we've talked about here about having a non-anxious, positive, confident Christianity. I think if people come with they're confident in who they are, they're confident in their traditions, but not anxious, and no one's trying to necessarily persuade on some of those theological categories. There's more, we're interested in children's ministry, we're interested in raising children to know and love Jesus. Let's, major on the things that we agree about. And when there's disagreement, notice those with curiosity rather than with anxiety. So, I personally find that really stimulating and exciting.
Which I suppose that could lead to a little bit more of tension, but it's not really the case.
Yeah, it's kind of, we'll talk a little bit later today about social media. And a lot of the sort of stereotype of social media is people are just fighting all the time, and people find the smallest thing to disagree about, and you try and raise your profile on social media by being angry and by disagreeing. And that's just not at all my personality. And this kind of really collaborative and being curious by alternate ideas rather than being threatened by alternative ideas. That's a space that I think I'm a peacemaker by nature. So people who get angry and anxious with each other, I just want to back out of those conversations. But people who are curious about difference, that excites me.
Yeah, that's cool. I've never spoken at any kind of conference or anything like that. Is it fun doing that? Sure, you've even done that as well, right? Just talking about different things like intergenerational ministry and those kind of things.
Yeah, I've done that from time to time.
Yeah, but I've never done it. Yeah. So good luck.
Thank you. Yeah.
And have fun.
I'm sure I will.
Is it in May? Is that right?
Second last week of May.
Okay.
So
cool.
So it should be there spring-ish.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any hot
it's
tips?
a cold city in winter.
Any hot tips for it is a cold city.
You've been to
Chicago. I love Chicago. It's a sick city.
Give me some hot tips. I haven't been to Chicago yet.
Okay.
I went there in 2013 too.
The river architecture cruise is a must.
Okay.
It's very, very interesting.
I completely agree.
I think because of all the mob money in the early part of the 20th century, they put heaps of money into their architecture, and it's amazing, the stuff they built. And they continue to have that vibe, and up until this day. The most amazing building was like a building that was on a footprint. I'm going to say this wrong, but I'm going to guess. It was like 2 or 3 swimming pools as a footprint, and they built a skyscraper on it. And it goes up like, they call it a Y building or something, I think. And it starts off this tiny footprint, goes up like that, and then it goes boom, right, massive. And you just go past it and you're just like, how on earth is that standing up? Yeah. It's fantastic. Right. It's incredible.
I really enjoyed Chicago because we're in the summer, and the river thing is really cool. Like you get to walk along the river a lot.
It is.
Things like that. And really I completely agree. The architectural tour where you go on a boat along the river is just so fascinating.
I didn't think I'd be interested. I only went because my family wanted to go, and then when I was there, I'm like, wow. I find it really interesting when they talk about the different architects and the different schools, and that was cool. And then the Blues Brothers sites where they filmed Blues Brothers was fun, and they got some good food, great food, really nice parks. Yeah, it's a really nice city.
Excellent.
I have an enduring memory of Chicago. I think it was the second last or last night we were there, and we had a few. We went to Chicago because one of our friends was marrying someone from Chicago, so they went and got married in Chicago, and they moved back to Sydney. And we just were walking around with it, like it was a bit of a disparate group of people that we used to go to church with or something like that, and it was really humid because it was like right in the middle. It was July, so it was really humid and sunny, and so we're kind of sweating a bit and we're like looking for somewhere for dinner, and we found this pub that was down on the river, and it wasn't that. Like there wasn't that many people there. We're like, oh, we'll see how it goes. And we ordered these burgers, and my gosh, they're probably some of the best burgers I've ever had in my life. Like just sitting there with friends on a hot day.
Yeah, unreal.
We had a cold beer and a burger, and I was like, wow, this is really,
Unreal.
really cool experience. So that's the enduring memory I have of Chicago.
Yeah,
I also found on that architecture tour why it's called the Windy City. It's not because it's windy. It's because there was something to do with the political scene that they were all called windbags. So they were all full of hot wind, basically. It was something to do with that people were just talking too much. Not because
It was a cool story with their river. Apparently the river was just flowing through and all the rubbish from Chicago was going in it, and it was going downstream, and all the cities downstream sued them or something.
Well, I think because it caught on fire.
And it caught on fire, it was so polluted. And it was just bubbling all the time. It was disgusting. But then they somehow reversed the river, so the river flows in the opposite direction.
Did, yeah.
I don't know how they did it.
I think they might have dug it deeper at the Lake Michigan end, maybe
something like that. And then this other town got shafted or something, or
because of that.
I can't remember the story now, but I remember laughing quite heartily because the person who was doing the tour was very sophisticated, but they were kind of having these jibes at this other city, and it was quite entertaining. It was good. Yeah. No, it's good. I thought I was really cool because I bought myself a Cubs hat when I went to Chicago, and I seriously walked out of my motel room, walked onto the street with my family. I walked a block, went to go across the road, and these kids from Chicago looked at me and went, "You don't look like a local. You shouldn't be trying." I'm like, I hadn't even opened my mouth. And I'm like, "How did you know I wasn't from here?" They go, "Oh, you just don't look like you're from here."
Yeah.
I said, "Oh, I'm not trying to look like I'm from here." "Yeah, yeah." And they just full on straight up like that. And I'm like, "Oh, okay, wow. Speak your mind." But then I had all these compliments for the rest of the week. Like I had a different pair of glasses on, and I was in Kmart or something, and this guy goes, "Nice glasses," and we kept walking. I'm like, and then Lou, the next day, this lady goes, "Oh, nice hat, I like your hat." So I don't know if there are any Americans listening or watching, is that an American thing to just be super honest, either one way or the other? I don't know.
Yeah, on the same trip I was in New York on the subway, and some woman was had her headphones in and listening to some music, and you could tell that the man sitting next to her didn't know her. And he could see that she was enjoying the music. He's like, "Oh, can I have a listen?" And then they started listening to the music together and enjoying it together. No, I think it must be. I find Americans are much better at small talk than Australians.
Are they?
So I think there's something of like this surface level thing of they're quite happy to talk to each other.
Fascinating.
But I don't know if maybe they're not too keen on going deeper.
Yeah.
But they're just happy to talk. To keep occupied, maybe.
Okay, maybe. Interesting.
Maybe that's part of it.
I thought that was kind of fun anyway. So hopefully you have some fun experiences. And there's a fantastic comic shop. That's where I got your Batman thing.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Did I give it to you? I can't remember.
You did.
I can't remember.
Yeah,
I bought you a magazine or something.
It's just funny because you went last year, wasn't it?
Yeah.
You haven't given it to him yet.
Well, I don't think I've given you the soap I bought for you. Found some.
You got him a Batman magazine and here's some soap, Joel. You smell.
Yeah.
No. It was
secondhand. He just took it from the motel on his way out.
At the time, everyone, Joel and I were...
There's a half-filled shampoo bottle as well.
At the time, Joel and I were laughing about all the politics in America.
Yeah.
And it was Trump 24 stuff started coming out. And there was something about Republican soap to wash away all the liberal views or something. So I bought him this. Did I give it to you?
I'm trying to remember.
I had it all in my suitcase.
I don't remember the soap.
Everyone's going to get bored and switch off of this episode, but just really quickly, what happened to my present buying overseas? I bought something for all the staff members.
You did.
But then I also went to Tombstone, and I wanted to have a glass of whiskey that Wyatt Earp and the crew used to drink at the same bar that they used to drink at before the gunfight at the OK Corral. So Doc Holliday apparently had a shot of whiskey and then went down to the gunfight. And then when Wyatt Earp was asked, "What did you learn from the gunfight at the OK Corral?" he said, "Never take a drunk dentist to a gunfight." So I thought that was hilarious.
Wow.
So not that I'm a massive fan of whiskey, but I wanted to just experience the history. Anyway, there's this old Overholt whiskey that Doc Holliday used to drink, and they still make it, and they sell it from the bar, and you can still drink the same whiskey that he drank from the bar. Anyway, I wanted to have a go at that. Mm-hmm. So then I thought, I'm going to take a bottle home with me. So I put it in my son's bag, and it got smashed in the bag in flight. And so all the presents half my presents and all of Elijah's clothes and poor thing, 3 of the things that he bought were all soaked in whiskey. So anyway, there you go.
Like you
Don't
didn't
put
catch on
whiskey.
fire.
Yeah, don't put, and I declared it and everything. Don't put whiskey in your luggage.
Or at least protect it. Did you protect it
I
at all?
put it in a little thing, and it's all got smashed.
Yeah.
Don't know how.
It's not pleasant. Worst issue I had, that was a shampoo exploded in my bag at some point.
Yeah, right.
That's not good.
No, it isn't.
Anyway, we'll move on from travel horror stories.
You can even edit all that out if you need to.
Nah, let's leave it in.
A little bit of colour on the podcast.
Yeah, a bit of real life. Anyway, let's move on to the article, Tim, that you kind of suggested a few weeks ago. We're only just getting to it now. But it is entitled The State of Culture 2024. Please,
It's a very grand title.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? For a grand man. Grand Poobah.
Conference speaker.
I've spoken at many conferences.
The author, Ted Gioia,
Or
maybe, perhaps.
Gioia? Yeah, I don't know how you pronounce
Apologies, Ted. But he's, this was on his
Do you know?
Substack.
Just on that name, there's a. My family come from Yorkshire, and if you don't agree with someone, you say Gioia. And I read that as Gioia.
What does that mean, though? Get off, get out of here?
Get over it. Or get over. Give over. Or give over.
Or give over. But then they've...
Yeah, Gioia. Like, so if someone's saying, I don't agree with you, it's Gioia. So there you go.
There you go.
Maybe he's from Yorkshire.
Maybe he is. He's talking about the post-entertainment society. And I thought it was really interesting. So he starts by talking about how there's often a tension between art and entertainment, and artists are like, I'm just going to create this, and people have got to, take it as it comes, and I'm the artist, I'm going to create this thing. But actually that doesn't really work, because people will, buy what they like, and so if you actually want to make money, then you're actually going to be servicing entertainment rather than art. So entertainment is bigger than art, and so you end up creating what people want and what people will buy and what will be consumed. Then he talks about how actually we're now in this post-entertainment culture. And so he starts to notice some of the entertainment companies that are struggling. He talks about Disney is shrinking, Paramount just laid off 800 workers, Universal is releasing movies to streaming after 3 weeks in theatres. Warner Brothers makes more money cancelling films and releasing them. He talks about the Batwoman film that got almost fully made, but then didn't get released.
Really?
Because it was going to cost them too much money to release it. So
it was cheaper to cancel.
It was cheaper to cancel than to actually release it. He talked about how even TV streaming services, the number of scripted series has started shrinking in the last year. And he talks about even in the music industry, there was a big purchase recently of Michael Jackson's catalogue, 1.2 billion, but he says no label will invest even a fraction of that amount on launching new artists. In 2024, musicians are actually worth more old than young, worth more dead than alive. And so he's raising all these questions about why is the entertainment industry shrinking and what's replacing it. And his argument is that it's the distraction culture is taking over. Distraction culture is taking over entertainment. And so we see this with, the use of handheld devices and the social media and YouTube and those kinds of things, where it's actually just about swiping through to the next thing and being pacified by really low quality entertainment, which is all just, you're not even trying to create real quality entertainment anymore. You're just trying to keep people distracted and keep them online.
Yeah, right.
And so his final piece is then actually the distraction culture is really being eaten up by addiction, because the way that these media companies keep you in order to monetize your attention is to keep you addicted to their platform. And so he talks about how TikTok is kind of the most excellent version of this in terms of just very bite-sized bits of content which is designed to be quickly consumed, quickly forgotten, but every new one you swipe to gives you a little dopamine hit. He talks about how the dopamine hit gives us a feel-good impulse at the time, but quickly fades. But we also get used to a certain level of dopamine, which means that dopamine doesn't quite satisfy anymore. So we keep searching out more and more extreme versions of things, more and more variety. And so his state of the culture is we're in this culture of addiction, where addiction is the goal, and so his argument is that this is where culture is, and this is where we're being fed, and the big downside of this is actually this high reliance on quick dopamine hits leads us to depression, anxiety, and even suicidal thoughts, which the tech companies know about. But he says they don't care. The CEOs all know the score. The more their tech gets used, the worse all the psychometrics get, and yet they still push aggressively forward because they don't want to lose market share to the other dopamine cartel members. And so that's the state of the culture, according to TED, in the year 2024, is that this is where we are, particularly in this kind of visual stimulus space and even auditory stimulus space. And so he goes on about, he's got, 7 different categories, and how we've moved from slow traditional cultures through to fast modern cultures and then to dopamine cultures. So a couple of these in athletics, we used to get fulfilled by playing a sport. The fast modern culture moves us to watching a sport, and the dopamine culture has us gambling on sport because it's about the quick fix on whether you're making money on that at a time. Journalism went from newspapers to multimedia, now just to clickbait headings. Video, film and television, so quality sort of entertainment and art, through to videos and now just short reels. Music, you had full albums that you would just sit and listen to the full album, through to the just tracks, and the iPod I think was particularly relevant there in sort of stripping away the the whole full context of an album and just being able to listen to particular tracks at whim. He says now you don't even listen to tracks, you listen to just TikTok clips, which are 15 seconds long, those kind of things. Images, you go from the art gallery to the digital media, now you're just scrolling and quickly scrolling on a phone, those kinds of things. So, and even in relationships, he talks about how, you move from courtship and marriage. The fast modern culture has this, sexual freedom and promiscuity, but now dopamine culture is just, swiping right on your Tinder app and just constantly going through all the different quick little dopamine hits to find someone. So, that's kind of saying that's where we're at in 2024. And this is really, it's bad for us as cultures who are engaged in this because of the severe mental health that comes out of being involved in that kind of dopamine culture.
I think there's a fair bit of truth to that, and I was thinking about have I experienced this, and I think it's probably, I would say that TikTok is extremely addictive, which is why I deleted my account. But then I think the one I've experienced the most is YouTube, where there's all these lots of interesting videos, and you watch one and then I'll want to watch another one, and then I want to watch another one, and I'm like, I'll just watch one more, then I'll get you can feel you get to this point where it's like nothing's ever going to be enough if I keep watching a video. And I think that's speaking to the addiction side of things, is that how much more do we need to actually be supposedly fulfilled? But if we keep getting these dopamine hits, the effectiveness of those dopamine hits wears off, so you need something higher and higher and higher to continue.
Yes.
So I want to ask you this, do you agree with what Ted's saying? Is that something that you've experienced or something that you have observed?
I think it's an interesting theory, and I'm still processing it. I think there's definitely an interesting trajectory that we're on. I'm trying to work out, is it part of a long-term trajectory or is it brand new? I think some of his conclusions about popular entertainment are interesting. There's lots of different theories around why people aren't going to the cinemas as much and why they're not watching certain franchises as much as they used to do. So, for example, the superhero franchises were incredibly popular before COVID, but now there's kind of superhero fatigue, some people are calling it. Other people are saying that the preponderance of messaging in the modern movies around what some people call woke ideology are part of the reason why people are tuning out, because there's a lot of preachy kind of movies that are very explicitly presenting a certain picture of DEI to consumers that they don't seem to be embracing. So, and when the fans don't embrace the new directions in Star Wars, for example, the fan base is reacting against some of that messaging because they feel like it's a corruption of the legacy, I think they call it in that sort of culture. The legacy of certain franchises seems to be changed, and so fans that are disagreeing online seem to have a lot of power. So there's critics like Nerdrotic, I think his name is, and the Critical Drinker. I don't know if you heard those names, but Critical Drinker's got millions of followers, or 2 million followers, or something like that. And so the old Rotten Tomatoes or the broadsheet critics, the write for newspapers, seem to be also in a marketplace with these new YouTubers who just come out and say, you know what, from a fan point of view, what the fan base, or part of the fan base, is thinking towards things. So there's a polarisation within the customer bases of some of these products that are being put out as well. One of the interesting things is that there's actual showrunners are speaking against the fans sometimes, calling them racists or sexist because they aren't embracing race-swapping characters and gender-swapping characters and the introduction of diversity into the movie. So there's a feeling, for example, that when Prime released the Silmarillion, their take on the Silmarillion, which is a Tolkien book, the fan base were scathing of things like they had a racially diverse group of elves, and there's this whole debate online about whether that's actually corrupting an original kind of legacy of Tolkien, who was writing for a particular audience. And then that leaks into a lot of the Disney stuff, where Disney are what has been called race-swapping characters, like the Little Mermaid, and having, instead of a redhead, they're having a African-American lady playing the part of the Little Mermaid. And then that goes further into even taking historical figures like Cleopatra on the Netflix special and making her an African-American lady when she was actually a Macedonian. So the whole country of Egypt got offended by Netflix changing the story. And then you get fans talking about the fact that the new Google AI engine was asked to draw a picture of George Washington, and it was a black guy. And so there's all this crazy stuff going around, and I think people are just getting fatigued from all that. And I think whether you call it woke or you don't call it woke, there's a deference to past stories that are constantly being mined for their popular cultural value, that it's easier to make a remake, but on another level it's almost a remake of that culture. So as I've looked at it from afar, I'm not heaps deep into it, but Disney took a lot of German historical narratives, children's stories, to create his original products. And so there's all these princess stories that are coming out of German stories. And so some people are saying that, by changing those stories, you're actually changing, where they came from. And so there's this big debate about cultural appropriation, where some people are saying it's not right for white people to culturally appropriate other races' stories, but then fans are pushing back, saying, well, some of the stories that they've known and loved have been appropriated and changed. But then because of the whole institutionalised racism debate, and people saying that our culture needs to be changed, there's people using popular culture to try and change cultural perceptions of what it is to be American or what it is to be English. So, you get things like Henry VIII's wives having, there was some musical about Henry VIII's wives, I can't remember what it's called now, Ethan went and saw it, but one of the ladies was a black lady, for example. So, there's this idea of looking at the Joan of Arc story, and there was another musical about Joan of Arc, and she's been presented as a transgender lady. There's a remake and a musical about Romeo and Juliet. What would happen if Juliet didn't actually commit suicide with Romeo, but she went on to be in a same-sex relationship and become queer, for example. So there's a lot of really interesting things coming out of popular culture that have this sort of message in it that some audiences are embracing, but more, it seems, are being jarred by it. So there is a lot of commentary about that on YouTube and on social media, so that people get addicted to that as well, I think. So people are wanting to find out, for example, the latest portrayal of Snow White as a Latinx lady, I think is the proper classification, I think. That got a lot of criticism because Snow White is known as white because of her skin colour. So to have a Latina as Snow White is a deliberate deconstruction. So is that a postmodern deconstruction, or is it something more? Is it? So I think postmodernism's coming to a really interesting place where it's so deeply embedded in capitalism at the same time as this author is suggesting that there's this dopamine hit of addiction that's being brought into it too. But then there's also this messaging that's coming through a lot of the movies that people are turning off, and a lot of the streaming platforms are having trouble attracting audiences. Movies are getting cancelled, possibly because of superhero fatigue, but possibly because people feel like the movies are becoming a bit preachy. So some people have pointed to the fact that I can't remember the name of the actor or the part she played even in the Prime Tolkien. I can't remember what they called it either. Do you remember what the Prime Tolkien show was?
No, I can't remember what it was called.
Yeah, might look it up.
Oh, was that Rings of Power? Or something?
Yeah, Rings of Power, that's right. Yeah, but they kind of change the story and they add different races in it, and they add different, storylines and stuff. So there's these purists who are like, no, that's not actually anything like what the Lord of the Rings series was like, which is those three movies were trying to stay true to the Lord of the Rings. This is kind of adapting it to a modern audience, I think is the phrase they use for modern audiences. So, and if you look at the Snow White, the Disney Snow White remake, which was going to be, I think it's been cancelled, or I'm not sure anyway, it's been delayed, but they changed the dwarves because that was politically incorrect. They changed the dwarves into magical people, and they were going to have a number of people who were racially diverse and sexually diverse, and they were going to be the 7 helpers of Snow White. And the idea was that Snow White wasn't going to be a romance anymore. It was going to be about this empowering of a strong female character. But Rachel Zegwiller, I think I pronounced her last name wrong, but she became quite outspoken about the fact that the story was obviously set in the 30s and it needed upgrading for a modern audience. And it was a bit weird because the prince was kind of stalking Snow White. So there's all this kind of controversy going on around a fairy tale that was just a kid's story back in the day, but now it's bringing on this... There's almost like a culture war around all these new movies that are coming out as well. So at one level, I get confused because at one level there's just this base level of let's just do a remake because we'll make money. And then at another level it's like, well, let's do a remake so we can remake the story of who we are. So we can tell the story again from a modern point of view and change how we see that story. It changes who we are. And that's nothing new. I mean, just one last thing, people have been doing that with characters for decades and centuries because, I mean, you look at the story of, say, for example, Robin Hood, and each generation of people who tell that story tell it for their generation and use the character of Robin Hood to portray what they think Robin Hood should be in their generation. And it's actually quite fascinating if you ever have time to go back and watch 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s movies just to see how they portray characters. And if you can find something like Tombstone, like the story of the OK Corral, and watch the progression of how it was told over, I think the first Tombstone movies, OK Corral movies about Wyatt Earp started coming out in the 40s, or just after he died actually, 30s, 40s, 50s. But then you see how the retelling of the story changes right up until Tombstone, the movie, was the last big one, I think, in the 90s. You can see that's what culture does, it retells stories. But there's a really fascinating backlash against the modern retelling of the story now because our culture's become so pluralified and so fractured that it's kind of difficult to speak to our modern audience when there are polarised modern audiences. So, and yeah, you can see it in movies like Barbie and some people watch Barbie and really take on that message of the patriarchy, whereas some blokes have watched Barbie and think Ken's the star of the whole thing, and it celebrates the patriarchy. So there's this strange confluence of ideas that are being attached to different artefacts in our generation that is quite more complicated than I think it used to be.
I think it was funny that you mentioned Robin Hood, and I think the first real understanding of Robin Hood for me was Robin Hood Men in Tights.
Yeah,
which is a Mel Brooks movie, right?
Yep, classic. Yep.
And it's a very funny movie,
Yeah,
but
it
it's
is.
also like, this is, what I learned later was this is probably not a totally accurate portrayal of what the story's about.
But it'd be funny if you go back and watch it and look at the jokes and see what the jokes are trying to have fun with, and it tells you something about the people who made it and what Mel Brooks thinks of the story.
Because it came out after Prince of Thieves, didn't it? So it's, a large part of it is spoofing Prince of Thieves in the same way that his Spaceballs was spoofing Star Wars.
Yeah. And that's why I mentioned Robin Hood, because if you look at the most modern Robin Hood that I'm aware of, a bunch of teenagers of different races running around in London.
Oh, is it?
And it's really trying to tell the story to a modern audience. So then if you go back and look at it from Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, it's almost unrecognisable. But also modern retellings of Robin Hood will also usually include an African who has come along with him on the journey back from the fighting in the Holy Land back to England, so they can add an African cast member into the story. So you'll often see things like that. But modern movies are often sometimes criticised for not being racially diverse enough. So was it the Nolan film Dunkirk that was telling the story about the British evacuation in World War II? And there was a big criticism that there were no Africans in the movie, portrayed in the movie, but there actually weren't any Africans on the beach.
Accurate.
So doesn't the historical reality of that, I mean, there actually probably were Indians on the beach that could have been portrayed. But yeah, now you'll often see movies where they're trying to make a historical place look a bit more like modern LA than what it would have been like in the time. So Viking movies with African people in the Viking clans and things like that. So it's just an example of how I think people are rewriting stories to try and tell the modern narrative. You also see it in Doctor Who. The earlier shows of Doctor Who were sort of showing a sort of morality that was good versus evil, and it was actually more based in a Christian worldview, actually, but now it's more based in a inclusive kind of context, particularly having Doctor Who become a woman. And even, is it David Tennant that was in the latest Christmas episode of Doctor Who, and they actually said that he was gay in the show and things like that. So this is what happens in popular culture right through. I mean, Francis Schaeffer has a model for that I'd like to share briefly before we go back to the other article. And he says that often philosophy influences art, art influences music, music influences culture, and then culture influences theology. So he thinks there's a progression, and that's what I think was in the back of my mind while I was listening to that.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So I guess the question would be, how would you expect that theology might be influenced if this is where if culture has got to this point of having distraction and addiction are the key things that are driving our cultural engagement? What's the downflow effect into our theology?
Well, it was interesting. I was at a theological conference last year, and one of the presenters was saying that one of the problems with theology now is there's too many white theologians, and the white theologians need to actually stand aside and have a more diverse range of ethnic voices speaking into theological contexts. And when I heard that person say that, I thought, oh, okay, that seems to be what Schaeffer's saying is happening, that a philosophical view has influenced popular culture, which is now influencing our theological context. But I think if we go back a couple of weeks to when we were talking about that Andy Crouch stuff, that a good thing, I mean, we're critiquing culture now, but a good thing to do is create culture. So I think theology should drive our culture. So that's where I think I'm a bit more Barthian, because Karl Barth talks about the fact that the Bible is actually the authority of the Christian community, and the Christian community get together around the Word of God and work out together what it means for them in their local context to actually live that out. And I think that's where Andy Crouch kind of comes to mind about that idea of creating culture is a good response to cultural change, because you're actually part of the cultural change. So my thought is, if the secular culture is moving towards a dopamine addiction culture, that actually means that the weekly gathering of God's people physically together around the Word of God is really good thing to do, because we can actually be creating cultural alternatives that come out of that. And so, rather than just critiquing, condemning, copying or consuming culture, I think this encourages me to think, let's be brave and sometimes turn off TikTok, or, if we are going to continue to use social media, let's also make sure we actually gather socially around the Lord as well, because that will be helping us to determine how not to slip into anxiety and depression, because we'll have real relationships. So.
That's really important to think it like that, I think, because here's a question, I suppose, is getting around the Word of God like you were suggesting, Stu, do you think that actually enables us to more easily create Christian culture? So rather than consuming it and, like you're saying, criticising it, we talked even a couple of weeks ago about slowing down and and possibly avoiding that kind of dopamine addiction cycle.
It's interesting.
Do we, using the Word of God, is that, if we're using that to slow down, does that help us slow down with those things, but then also help us to create culture? Like I said, I suppose I said, it's more, it feels like it would be easier to do it if we are continually seeking to do that.
What do you think, Tim?
Yeah, I was just thinking, I'm not sure if Crouch talks about an order of those things, or if he just puts them out as flat alternatives, but I wonder whether you can't create the new unless you have first critiqued what's there. And the thing that's in my mind is, you're trying to, we talked a few weeks ago, I think it might have been the episode with John, where, every culture, every cultural manifestation or artefact is going to be, as Augustine says, a mixture between the city of God and the city of man. So there's going to be things in every culture and every artefact that you can notice the goodness of creation in those things, and you can notice the fallenness of nature in those things as well. And nothing is 100% pure, and nothing is 100% fallen. You've always got that mixing of both. And so part of what, as far as I know, this article, Ted is not a Christian guy. So he is critiquing culture not from a Christian point of view, but just from noticing the psychological damage that is being caused by this dopamine addiction. But we can notice that sort of critique of culture. We can hold that critique of culture up to the lens of the Word of God, and subject everything to the Word of God, and notice, things that immediately come to mind for me would be, the fruits of the Spirit. Self-control being a significant one, is not being activated when we give ourselves over to.
Yeah, that's awesome.
There's kind of doom scrolling on TikTok or Instagram, where you just constantly just go through and losing track of time. When you watch too many YouTube videos, whatever it is, you've actually lost what ought to be characteristic of the people of God. So we can bring theological conversations into that, and then it's through that critique that we can then go, well, what is now the creational alternative? And I think part of what we've talked about in the deficit of just having a critique culture is you're not producing the positive Christian good out of that. But we can notice that here's the negatives of our cultural, and particularly the media in our culture, and say, well, okay, now we are responsible for creating that cultural good. And so it is that slowing down, it's that creating space, it's the spending time with each other in incarnate relationships. We're actually being physically present with others for long periods of time without distracting elements, but actually knitting ourselves deeply into each other in relationships, where we're actually creating the spaces where cultural goods can come out of that, which may be particularly artefacts, but it might even just be the community itself. And this, I suppose, comes back to that third place idea, that you actually the cultural good you're creating is that third place where people want to be and long to be. And I think this is the hope that I see in some of these critiques of our dopamine addicted culture is part of it's really hard to break out of that. Like, people are genuinely addicted and can't imagine life outside of this. He quotes an author, Anna Lembke, who wrote a book called Dopamine Nation. And there's an anecdote that Anna shares in her about a patient she had. She's a psychologist. A patient coming to seek help for depression and anxiety. In the session, I suggested she try walking to class without listening to anything and just letting her own thoughts bubble to the surface. She looked at me both incredulous and afraid. Why would I do that? She asked, open-mouthed. So she finds it really hard she said, first it was really hard, and then I got used to it and even kind of liked it. I started noticing the trees. And I just think that's, again, a secular example, but we're at this place where people are strongly addicted to these things, and therefore it's really hard to break through to them with the message. And some people want to copy culture and go, oh, well, therefore we need to make Christian content for TikTok. We need to make Christian content for Instagram, for social media sites, because we just need to copy culture in order to put out something that people will accidentally stumble across, hopefully, in their algorithm that will tell them about Jesus. But the alternative is realising that the people are deeply unhappy with the state of where they are. He talks in here about the World Happiness Report, says that out in 26 countries, US and other prosperous technologically advanced societies are suffering a massive happiness decline. And so we're also at this precipice where if we can help people to realise how unhappy they are and realise that they're actually the alternate Jesus community, which is this third place, positive cultural good, may actually be a freedom that they're looking for outside of these addictions, that help them to realise that longing that is within them, and that there's an answer to this. And then the one last thing we talked a lot last year when the Jesus Revolution movie came out. I've just finished listening to the audio book, and what's his name, Greg? Who's the author?
Oh, he's the pastor.
Yes.
Can't remember his last name.
Greg Laurie, sorry. Greg Laurie writes at the end of the book, he says, are we ready for a new revolution? And which we also talked about in our series a little while ago, last year, year before, maybe, about a new revival. And he said, well, God seems to work and God seems to bring revival when people realise their deep need for him. And he kind of wondered, he leaves the book hanging, and it's a few years old now, the book, so he's not quite on top of all the latest TikTok and Instagram and all those kinds of things, but he realises that as long as people are living in a distracted world, they may not realise, but then if we actually are hitting this point where people are realising how unhappy they are, maybe we are on the precipice of people realising that there's got to be something more, that the life that they've been promised, that they've been given, isn't sufficient, and potentially we're on the cusp of people realising there's a deeper longing that the world is not meeting for them. So I guess that's kind of a bit of hope that I see in this as well.
What I'm thinking about is that in regards to the dopamine addiction cycle, people are unhappy, that church can be the alternative. And the reason that that's not a new thing to say, but I think that I also wonder if we look back in this time and the pace of technological change, it was more just no one knew how to keep up with it. Like, we were just experiencing so much change and so much almost addiction, as we're talking about, to have like people looking at their screens all the time, and there's so much consumer reliance on the internet now, even for our work and what we do. And I'm wondering if it's almost like similar to smoking, is that people didn't realise the dangers of it until a lot later. But then I'm also seeing, I was at my wife's cousin's place on Sunday, and she was showing me her record player. So you know how vinyls experience a real resurgence because we're so we're not so tired, but we're tired of just having what Ted Gio, the author, said of having these bite-sized little pieces. And you know, back in the days when you would use the vinyl, she even said to me on Sunday, I'm much more likely to listen to the entire album when I put the vinyl on. I'm like, oh, that's pretty cool. I even had a discussion with someone about self-driving cars. It's like, eventually self-driving cars will take over and we just walk out the door and press a button on our phone or something and it comes up and takes us to where we need to go. I said, yeah, I think that's true, but I think also the alternative will come out of that. People want to have genuine driving experiences. And I only say that because I'm interested in cars and things like that, but that will be because that is completely different, it'll be like, this is actually an escape out of something that I'm tired of or something that I'm really looking for. So I suppose my question, after saying all that, is, and we'll go with you first, Stu, if that's all right. Do you think that that's a we talk about postures and gestures, is that a posture that the church can take in terms of being an alternative, I don't want to call it an escape, but an alternative or a better way to live with that slowness church idea?
Yeah, one of the things Crouch says is that not all technological change is progress. In the West, we've got this sense that if we've got a self-driving car, that's progress, but it might not be. And he says that new technologies mean that it makes new possibilities, but also makes some old things impossible. So he uses the example of a motorway, and he says that before a motorway, you could ride your horse down the street. But when you have a motorway, you can't ride a horse on a motorway. So the motorway makes it possible for you to drive a car faster and get from place to place quicker, but you can't ride a horse on a motorway anymore. So people stop riding horses. So I think there's a synergy there with digital music, which is digital music make it possible for you to have every single album on Apple iTunes that's ever been made at the tip of your fingers, but it also makes it impossible to sit down and listen to a whole album, maybe, like you used to. For me, because I grew up with an appreciation of singles and albums, we'd like a song, we'd listen to the song, and then we'd give the album a try, but we wouldn't buy the album straight away. We would check out what other people thought of the album, because it was a big investment to buy an album, $17. So you needed, actually earlier it was $8, but that was still a big investment for a young person. And I remember, this is a bit of a go back in time, but I remember listening to Blame It on the Boogie, thinking it was a terrific song, and then hearing a song called Destiny, and I found out they were both on the same album. So I decided to use my savings to go and buy the Jackson's 5 Destiny album. And the idea of getting the album was to enjoy the whole experience of the music, not just that one song. And I used to see singles as gateways into someone's art, not the end product of it. So I think because I've grown up in that era, I now say, hey Google, play me Dire Straits album, Brothers in Arms. And so when I'm making dinner, I listen to an album. But yeah, it's interesting talking to younger people. They don't do that. Now, funnily enough, when compilations came along, compilation albums became very popular in the 80s to my memory. They were probably before then. But greatest hits and stuff were often frowned upon by people, because how can you actually get the full experience of a band by listening to their greatest hits? You've got to listen to their best album. That was the shift that people made. So, and coming back to something you said, Tim, where you said critiquing is part of creating, I think that's what's so good about practical theology, because practical theology says, what is happening? Why is it happening? Okay, people, today aren't listening to full albums. That's what's happening. Why aren't they doing that? Well, maybe they're pursuing a dopamine hit because they're addicted rather than actually enjoying the art like it was originally intended.
And the technology has created that pathway in order to make that the easiest option with the least friction.
Yeah, good point.
Facilitated by that technology.
Yeah. And then earlier you did the next step in the pastoral cycle, which is what does the Bible have to say?
Yeah, what ought to be going on.
What ought to be going on. And so you use the Bible to answer that question. And your new creative good that you create comes out of that process. And then the thing is that will create problems. And so the next time you go through that cycle, you say, okay, well now we've got this new reality. What's happening now? And then you go through it again. So I think that's a really cool description of the shock absorber, because the shock absorber is saying, let's get younger people to help us to understand what's going on. Together with them, we're trying to critique it. Together, we're going to sit under the authority of God's word as a Jesus-shaped community, and then together we're going to come up with our own cultural goods that we create. Sometimes they're because of a change. Sometimes they have nothing to do with a change. So one of the things that might be going on is people are feeling anxious. Yes, they're feeling anxious because of social media, but we don't necessarily have to create a kind of social media that will solve the problem. We actually could just say, well, actually having real relationships with Christians who are in their 70s might help with that.
And this is where...
that's where we get to intergenerational ministry,
Yeah. And I think, so another secular cultural critic that I really enjoy is Jonathan Haidt.
Yes.
And so he's written a number of really great books, Coddling of the American Mind, The Happiness.
Yeah, that's a great book.
And so one of his, he's got a new book is coming out in the next month or so called The Anxious Generation. But he's been, a lot of his Substack newsletters over the last month and a bit have been looking at this idea of social media, and he really puts a lot of this depression, anxiety onto social media, and he tracks the increase in mental ill health, and he says that there's this window of a couple of years where you get the front-facing camera on an iPhone, you get the like button on your social media, and Facebook buy out Instagram.
Yep.
So within a couple of years, all of these things happen. So now, particularly what you get, and he says it's particularly prevalent in young adolescent girls.
Isn't that funny?
That you've got a front-facing camera where you
funny,
can post...
not ha-ha, but funny, interesting. Yeah.
You then post your selfies that you've taken more easily because you can see what you're doing onto Instagram, and you've got this self-referential liking, and if you're liked or not liked, and how many likes have you got compared to this
instant
like.
Dopamine hit.
Instant dopamine hit. So he's got all these graphs that he's got, and all of the drop-offs happen within this couple of year period where all these things are happening. And he's also tracked that it's happening globally. So a lot of people have said, oh, no, it's not that, it's the financial crisis. He goes, well, no, that affected different people in different ways. So they say, oh, no, it's the gun epidemic in America. He goes, yeah, but this is happening in America, in Europe, it's happening in Australia, it's happening in New Zealand, it's even happening in Africa. So he says there can't be the US gun culture because it's much bigger than that. So, he's got whole Substacks where he tries to take seriously other people's arguments and says, but I just don't see that working. And he really puts it down to that. And so his most recent one that I've seen is he refers back to Marshall McLuhan about the idea that the medium is the message. And so this is going back to what you said about, it's not just creating more social media content or a different social media platform. If the medium is the message, if it's actually the medium of instant gratification, doom scrolling, quick hits, if the content that's on there makes a much smaller difference than the actual platform itself. And so the alternative is not better content on these platforms. The alternative is not being on the platforms, but is actually extracting ourselves from that into in-person, incarnate relationships. So he's spoken a lot about that recently as well.
Wow. I remember reading something from Jonathan Haidt saying that he said it was recommendations for schools. And he said, do not allow phones anywhere near teenagers until they're 16.
Yeah, I think this all comes out of his Anxious Generation book. There's
like a set of parameters to.
Yeah, so no smartphones till high school, no social media till 16. No phones in schools, full stop.
They've started implementing that.
Yeah, New South Wales government have started that.
And I think he's got one other, more outside play, because that's another thing. And that he started talking about in Coddling of the American Mind was the risk-averse parenthood has created risk-averse children who don't go outside to play.
Safety-ism, he calls it.
Yeah, safety-ism. Yeah, so there's a whole lot of
a big thing about how
there.
Child abductions and things like that got publicised a lot in the US. I think that's one thing he puts that down to.
Yeah, he talks about how the actual number of child abductions plummets and the anxiety about child abductions skyrockets. Right. And so you get this massive disconnect where parents are more fearful because children are your most precious commodity, like as a parent, like that makes sense. And yet the fear and the anxiety about that far outstrips the actual reality of it. And certainly abductions by strangers is almost unheard of, not completely, but any kind of abduction, usually a non-custodial parent is typically what happens if a child goes missing or gets taken. It's a custody is much more likely than a stranger on the street.
Right.
But our anxiety about it is so high.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's right.
No, I talking about Haidt, he tells a story and he says that he says that once upon a time, kids playing in the backyard and the rain comes, and the mum had probably laughed that the kids are playing in the rain and
getting dirty
and stuff. And he said today, it's more likely that the parent or carer would run out and grab the kids. Quick, come in before you get struck by lightning. So there's this dramatisation or catastrophising of every day that the worst could happen. And there's a storm coming. Get out of the backyard. You might get hit by lightning. It's a bit of an overreaction. And I've often thought about that because I've thought, well, it's actually my generation that are the carers and the parents that are doing that. And yet we kind of prided ourselves when we were younger on the carefree, stay out until we were the last generation to play on our bikes in the street. And if we got a cut, it was like, it was just, I'll put a Band-Aid on it or whatever. Yet we've brought up our kids and coddled them and we've created Safety-ism, I think, my generation, the Gen Xers. And I'm wondering what that is. And I don't know if there's a link between this, but I often wonder about my generation being the first generation to experience higher rates of divorce. And I wonder if as more, a higher proportion of my generation were brought up with parents who got divorced.
Were separated, yeah.
And separated, did that create a sense of something that has then meant that maybe sometimes we might overreact to a sense of we want our kids to be safe, and so maybe it comes from a good place because we want to create stability and safety for our kids. If we maybe have felt a bit unstable, some of our generation, that maybe overreacting to some of those performative realities when we were growing up could have related to the fact that once upon a time me and my friends would have all walked to school. There are more cars on the road, so maybe it is a bit more unsafe to cross the road these days, but we'd just walk to school and there was a lady with a boom gate or a lollipop person to get you across the road. But I was just struck in Grace Point where I was taking my kids to school, a number of people that dropped their kids off and picked their kids up who lived literally around the corner. And I was just like, it's crazy. Like, why are so many cars coming to pick up kids in a suburb that is majority of people live within walking distance to the school? Now, there were kids that walked home, but yeah, there's this sense of, I remember thinking it myself, my boys are walking through the bush to go to school, maybe that's not safe.
Yeah.
Like, possibly it's not safe, but they're all walking together, like it's probably pretty safe.
Those cars being picked up, like cars picking up kids, like reduces their outdoor play thing. I remember a few weekends ago, my 3 kids were just cranky and at each other all the time. Yeah. I said, hey guys, what do you think about this? Why don't you go and have some sprinkle time? It was a hot day. Yeah. And see how long you can stay outside for. Yeah, right. And they stayed outside for almost 4 hours in the backyard. But
isn't that interesting?
They were very, very calm and relaxed when they came back in.
Were they?
Yeah, it was really interesting.
Isn't that interesting?
And
That's really interesting.
I said, you can't come back in. You got to figure out how to play games together because there is a bit of an age. There's about 7 years age between my oldest and my youngest. And they figured out how to play with each other and they were just playing outside. It was, but I'm having the battle. The same thing with my son in terms of my mind was that he's trying to practice his cross country. Yeah. So he's going out and doing a couple of times a week 1.7k runs with my wife. Yes. And my wife Karen is saying, "Oh, well, should we maybe give him a chance to do it on his own?" I'm like, I want to give him that chance, but I'm also worried. I'm like, I trust you. I've said this to him. I trust you, but I'm not sure about other people. Yeah. Which is really interesting. And it's a bit dark and like maybe we wait till daylight savings, for example. But that's the,
But I used to play in the bush like until it got dark and come home. I was one of those classic memes where the street lights came home, we went home. Mum didn't know where we were all day. But we got parameters. She said, don't go further than this and this. And then she just whatever. But we used to play in the bush and make forts and all that sort of stuff. And I know that's trivial example, but it's interesting because Haidt sort of talks about a social contagion of safety-ism, that because we're all worried about it, we all reinforce each other's fears. Yeah. And I was thinking about that because a friend of mine is a school teacher, and she was talking to me about the fact that in the school lunchroom with other teachers, everyone's talking about how busy they are, how much their job's hard, and it's so hard, and they can't wait to get to the end of term. And when she started out as a teacher, she couldn't wait to get into the classroom. But then it's almost like as soon as she started in term, within 3 or 4 weeks, she couldn't wait to get out of the classroom. And it was just like, I can't wait for the term to be over. And she was noticing that all the other teachers were talking like that in the staff room and on social media. So on social media, all these teachers are like, 7 weeks to go, over the hump of the term. I don't know.
TikTok.
I can what's it called?
There's a teacher TikTok.
Is there?
Yeah,
right.
where it's always about your outfit and what you're wearing and stuff. But then it's like, I'm the end of of term.
Well, anyway, she felt like she was starting to abide that negativity, and all of a sudden it was like, I'm working hard, but I'm just sort of caught up in all this contagion of anxiety about being a teacher and overworked. Right. And she said, I started to compare myself to other professions and saw lots of people work really hard. It's not just teachers that work really hard and that are overworked. Everyone's overworked. So it's just, but there's this extra burden of anxiety about it that was in her particular culture, in her particular staff room, that had created her anxiety around, I can't wait for the holidays. And before she started, it was like, I'll use the holidays to prepare for the next term, and then I don't have to do a lot of the prep while I'm at school. But then she abided a culture of, I need to rest for 2 weeks because I'm done, because I'm overworked. And it was creating a self-fulfilling prophecy that she was never getting on top of a workload. Whereas other professions are working, 12, 14-hour days and not complaining about it. Lawyers and, different ambulance drivers and nurses, and I don't know, they probably have their own versions of that. But I was thinking about the Jesus-shaped community as a place almost for us to detox from those contagions. So if we come into a context where we're clothing ourselves with Christ and we're putting our hope in Jesus and we're not feeling alone and alarmed, then maybe that's a healthy thing that our cultural good can create for us, that can be an antidote to some of these contagions.
I think maybe also helps us trust God more too. If you're with other Christians trusting God, then it's almost like a positive version of social contagion, really, isn't it? Like the gospel is transforming that.
Excellent.
Rather than the culture is what's impacting us on it.
Yeah, and it's a place where Christian teachers can get together and go, do you all feel a bit anxious? Are you feeling like you hate your job? Yeah, well...
Or what do you do?
Normally when people hate their job, they just get another career. But we don't. We seem to be trapped in this career and we don't feel like we can move out of it, but we hate it. And what's happening there? So, and a lot of that's, there's really good reasons why teachers have some, there's pay issues, there's work, but a lot of careers have that as well. So I'm not denying that there's issues within certain careers, but I'm thinking it's interesting when you get a group of people together who are positive and focused on the gospel and living for eternity and can talk to each other about, do you let your kid run around the block? What sort of block is your block? Like, would you do that? And then it helps us. And, to have a grandparent there going, well, I'll let my kids run around the block, but there wasn't as many cars, so I think you should be careful of the cars. But I don't think there's necessarily someone in a white van who's going to grab them as they go just out of sight, sort of thing. So I think it's a case of how do we balance again, really, rather than go from one extreme to the other. Like, we don't want to be neglecting our kids either. It's good to be careful and to look after them as well. And I wonder if too, my generation was the first to really start pushing our kids into so many programmed events so that they didn't have any downtime, no alone time, and they're always supervised. I wonder about that. Like, why are kids going to sports, music practice, tutoring, when they should be just running around, having fun, being kids? Let your kids be kids as well. So, and everyone makes decisions about their finances as a family, but the number of kids who get a part-time job when some of the families don't need the money, and I sometimes wonder, are you actually teaching your kids, skills to become good at using money, or are you teaching your kids to be little capitalists who are really good at spending all the money they earn on themselves? So I just think all those kind of conversations like we have on the podcast are fascinating to have at church. But then if we've decreased church down to 1 hour a week with a cup of tea, how do you have those conversations? And that's why we've experimented with these dinners, not because the meal itself isn't necessarily a good in itself, but it just slows us down so we can have dinner with someone and go, Is your Sunday as crazy as mine? Because I don't know how I'm going to get through my day off, let alone get through my work day. So I think we're working ourselves too hard and we're playing too hard. And I think we forgot what rest is. And rest is not concentrating on a song or a podcast or a set of memes on a social media. That's not resting, because your brain is actively engaged in that. You need to stop and have a pray and just sit with a cup of tea and sit in the sun and be bored for half an hour. That's a rest as well, Or resting's actually being with God's people and serving each other. So there's some of the things I find interesting.
I was just thinking that why do I not want to let my son go for a run? I was like, I don't know if I could live with myself if something did happen to him.
That's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. That's what I was...
Is that catastrophizing,
Maybe.
or is that just healthy? That's a good question, isn't it?
Maybe it's a failure as me as a parent.
Is
it? Yeah, I think this is it's something I struggle with as well. My kids are older than yours now and do a lot more independent things. But yeah, there was always that tension in my head of the chances of something going wrong are almost infinitesimally small. Yeah. But the consequence of something happening is... enormous.
Yeah, that's true.
And it was that balance that I could never quite reconcile in my head.
That's a good point.
Of, if 999 times out of 1,000 or even more they would come home safely. But if they were that one kid that didn't, that's catastrophically bad. And I mean, it is catastrophizing because but I think that was the tension that was always running around in my head.
That's how I feel. Yeah, I think.
Was trying to work that one out.
Do you know a funny thing? My grandmother said that her grandmother didn't name her kids until they turned 5.
Wow.
Right.
Because the infant mortality rates were so high that they didn't want to get too attached to a child in the slums in Sheffield until they reached 5, and then they went, this kid's probably going to make it.
I think that's an interesting cultural shift as well when you think about where
I'm not saying
we
it's
are.
right, it's just interesting.
No, I'm just but you go back that many generations and you have such high infant mortality compared to now. Where you still read historical texts about people who are just absolutely gutted and devastated, and people who go into clinical
Lincoln's
depression.
Wife went into depression after her 8-year-old died.
Yeah, absolutely. So it doesn't. I don't think it minimises the hurt, but there is that when you're in a time period or a geographic location where that's more normal. I don't know what the right way to say it. When it's more common,
happens more common.
Yeah. Whereas for now, in where we are in the modern West, in the 21st century, it's so unheard of for a child to die, which I think raises that.
It's rarer.
Yeah. Yep. So when it does happen, I think it just adds to that catastrophe nature of it. Because it's so rare. We expect now that every child would outlive their parents.
Yeah. So that's interesting, isn't it? Because technology's made life safer. The safer we've become, the more we expect it to be safe. So there's that idea of the theory of increasing expectation. So the more you get, the more you expect. Yep. We're looking after our kids more and more for whatever reason. We're more worried about their safety. They're being brought up possibly more anxiously. Maybe they're getting a bit of anxiety from their parents as well as other things like technology. Technology fuels that again with social media as they're growing up. Then they go to university and they're insisting on safe spaces and words are now hateful. There's all this kind of language around harm being not just physical but also emotional and verbal and hate speech and all this sort of stuff that Jonathan Haidt speaks about. And then he's saying that they're the next generation of philosophers. So that philosophy is now being written up in universities and then it's being enacted in government departments and corporations with programs around, putting those sorts of those ideas into practice. Popular media is promoting those things. So that line of going from philosophy to art that Schaeffer talks about. So it's almost like technological change is creating new philosophies, which are creating new art, but the funny thing is that people are now starting to react against that art. Yeah. And maybe there might be a start of a turning point of maybe a few things, like maybe does excessive consumeristic individualism have its limits? is there a point where people have been blaming Christianity for all the ills of society for so long that now that they're taking Christianity out of most of the public square, some of these issues are only getting worse? Is there eventually going to be a time where people are saying, oh, we thought Christianity was the reason for all these problems, but now we've got this new society we've built, it's got problems. And then are people going to look for new solutions after that? It might take a while, but I remember someone telling me once that when you see the tide go out, don't panic too much because it'll come back again. Tide always comes back in. And so that's an interesting dynamic. When you look at over a century, you actually do see over centuries, you see periods of progressiveness and periods of conservativeness following that. So the progressiveness of the Charleses in England, the King Charles and all the excesses of that reign then led to the Puritans. And then the excessiveness of the Puritans led to another progressive moment after the Puritans had been in power for 50 or so years. So some people have theories around that there are 50-year cycles for some of these things. And if you think about it, since the 1960s and the progressive movement towards progressive ideas that kind of was unleashed in the West during that period of time, it's like 50 years ago. So there's an interesting theory that maybe some of these movies that are really pushing in on those progressive values, maybe there is a certain number of people who are like, I just want to see some people fly some planes around. I don't really need that preaching at me, sort of thing.
But you see some of the reaction on the other side of politics and ideology, and their answer is often, oh, well, no, we need to make art which pushes our particular ideology. So they're looking for Daily Wire, creating their own
Disney
media.
Well, not Disney, but making their own Snow White, aren't they?
Oh, I don't know. I haven't heard that detail. But
they have. They've created a new Snow White to correct what they think is the disconnection.
And the interest, like in a country as large as the US, when you have this polarization where it's no one's trying to unite, everyone is trying to create one of the polarizations. Though there's small examples. So last year, one of the highest grossing movies was the Mario and Luigi movie.
Pretty good movie, that, actually.
I didn't see it.
It was good fun.
Yeah, okay. But I think one of the things that they talked about was that it didn't have any super conservative or super progressive.
That's right.
It was just
old time entertainment.
They
used to make an entertaining movie to entertain people, which is interesting because this shift of culture towards dopamine, maybe people are starting to get sick of it and they actually do want some art and they want a bit of entertainment.
There's like people talking about social media detoxes and things like that. As an example, I delete Instagram from Monday to Friday off my phone because it's not helpful.
Yeah,
I mean, in any way in terms of productivity. So I do think there is a shift towards going, hang on, this may not be the best thing for us in a lot of ways.
I think it's interesting, isn't it? And like the Oscars giving all those awards to Oppenheimer, and it wasn't a super preachy movie. It was just a really old school kind of movie.
Like
told a story.
Was it more art than...
Well, it was more art, I think, yeah. And then you look at Dune versus Star Wars. I mean, the Star Wars franchise is stumbling and falling, apart. I mean, there was this massive fan reaction against the latest director that was going to create the next trilogy of the Star Wars, story. And there's all this talk about Disney wanting to leave the legacy of Star Wars and create a new kind of Star Wars for a new modern audience. But the fan base has kind of rejected that. Then you get Dune come along, and it's just incredible. Like, I don't know if you've seen Dune 2, but it's such a departure from all that sort of stuff. It's so different, and it feels like Star Wars was when it first came out, because showing my age, but I remember going to see Star Wars for the first time, and it made everything obsolete. Like, it was one of those moments where you just go, I will never see a movie the same again after Star Wars, because everything was so cliche and so gimmicky and so tacky and then Star Wars came across, even from the opening sequence with the music and the way they use models, the way that just the whole storytelling. It was a story, and I think we've lost that a bit with just these constant remakes. We all know the story, and it's just a retake on us old story. Whereas Dune's come out, I don't know anything about Dune. I didn't really like it when it came out in the 80s, the first movie, and I didn't read the book. I'm not a purist, but just watching that first movie was just the cinematography was just incredible, and it wasn't. overproduced with the CGI. It just seemed to fit together with the storytelling arc. And now Dune 2 is even better, and people are raving about it, and people are going to see it again. So I think maybe eventually the market will readjust as people will work out what people will actually go and see. And maybe that's interesting. But it's also, we haven't talked today about it. We probably don't have time, to run out of time, but we'll have to talk maybe even next week about how fascinating it is that the Americans are thinking of banning TikTok. Like, that's a massive call. Like, yeah, and even libertarian Republicans who are struggling with it still see a reason to be very fearful of that platform. And it's not just because the CCP might have sort of links to the platform. I don't know about all that, but there's definitely concern for young kids watching that stuff.
Yeah, there's a reaction to it, isn't it? It's like, it's not just banning phones.
It's changing the way their brains
banning,
work. Like, they can't concentrate. It's crazy how
banning
powerful it is.
The entire platform is a huge step.
Yeah.
It's a very funny commentary about the fact that TikTok was pushing ads to tell people to call their representatives in the government.
Really?
And like, you could lose access to blah blah blah.
To this.
Anyway,
is it working?
Well, one of the funny comments was, there's no better way to alleviate the concern that the Chinese government might be influencing politics than telling you to getting the Chinese company to tell you to go and call your representative and influence your politics. And it is. But apparently, it's passed the first hurdle, the legislation.
Has it really? Gosh.
It definitely seems to be a new way of advancing geopolitical aims. I was just reading a book recently called Battlegrounds by, funnily enough, H.R. McMaster, because he was
famous relative of yours.
Yeah, we call him Uncle Henry.
Yeah.
But he was an advisor to Trump and other presidents, and was part of the military, and he talks about a whole lot of how much Russia has influenced various elections, but not in the old way of on the ground. It was all via the internet, as an example.
Well, with AI coming on, it's going to be scary. AI is going to look as real one day. It's lots to continue to talk about from a Christian point of view, isn't it?
But I think we should put a bow on this episode. Time to wrap it up.
I like that. Put a bow on it.
Yeah, it's been a very beautiful gift to everyone there.
I like that phrase.
It actually is a gift for our audience that continues to listen and pay attention to what we have to say and talk about and put bows on. So thank you very much.
Yes, they are a gift to us.
They really are. Thank you for
really
if you've been
listening.
Yeah, if you've been listening. Thank you if you've been listening or watching. You can email me, joel@shockabsorber.com.au, any of your favourite movies we've talked about, or what Jonathan Haidt has talked about, or even where Tim should go in Chicago.
Yes, let me know.
Yeah,
hit me up.
Let us know. But thank you, Tim and Stu. It's been a really fun podcast today. Thank you very much. And we'll finish with a one way.
One way.